The Story of Civilization, Part 2. The Life of Greece, being a history of Greek civilization from the beginnings and of civilization in the Near East from the death of Alexander to the Roman conquest, with an introduction on the prehistoric culture of Crete by Durant. Chapter 22. Alexander. Section 2. Paths of Glory. On his accession, Alexander found himself at the head of a tottering empire. The northern tribes in Thracia and Illyria revolted. Attalia, Acarnania, Phocis, Elis, Argolis renounced their allegiance. The Ambraciotus expelled the Macedonian garrison. Artaxerxes III boasted that he had instigated the killing of Philip, and that Persia now had nothing to fear from the immature stripling of 20 who had succeeded to the throne. When the glad tidings of Philip's death reached Athens, Demosthenes donned festival garb, placed a garland of flowers upon his head, and moved in the assembly that a crown of honor should be voted to the assassin Pausanias. Within Macedonia, a dozen factions conspired against the young king's life. Alexander rose to the situation with a decisive energy that ended all internal opposition and set the tempo of his career. Having arrested and decapitated the chief plotters at home, he marched south into Greece in 336 BCE, and within a few days reached Thebes. The Greek states hastened to renew their allegiance. Athens sent him a profuse apology, voted him 2 crowns, and conferred upon him divine honors. Alexander appeased, declared all dictatorships abolished in Greece, and decreed that each city should live in freedom according to its own laws. The Amphictyonic Council confirmed him in all the rights and honors that it had given to Philip, and a congress of all Greek states except Sparta, meeting at Corinth, proclaimed him captain general of the Greeks, and promised to contribute men and supplies for the Asiatic campaign. Alexander returned to Pella, put the capital in order, and then marched north to suppress the rebellion of the barbarian tribes in 335 BCE. With Napoleonic swiftness, he led his troops as far as the modern Bucharest and planted his standards upon the northern bank of the Danube. Then, hearing that the Illyrians were advancing upon Macedonia, he marched 200 miles through Serbia, surprised the invaders in the rear, defeated them, and drove the remnant back to their mountains. But in the meantime, a rumor had stirred in Athens that Alexander had been killed in fighting on the Danube. Demosthenes called for a war of independence and felt justified in accepting large sums from Persia to further his plans. At his instigation, Thebes revolted, killed the Macedonian officials left there by Alexander, and besieged the Macedonian garrison in the Kenmaya. Athens sent help to Thebes and invited Greece and Persia to join in an alliance against Macedon. Alexander, furious over what seemed to him not a passion for freedom, but for the crudest ingratitude and treachery, marched his weary troops down again into Greece. Reaching Thebes after 13 days, he defeated the army sent out against him. He left the fate of the defenseless city to her ancient enemies, Plataea, Orchomenus, Thespia, and Phocis. They voted that Thebes should be burned to the ground and her inhabitants sold as slaves. Hoping to give the other rebels a lesson, Alexander signed the order, which stipulated that the victorious troops should spare the home of Pindar and the lives of priests and priestesses, and of all Thebans to prove that they had opposed the revolt. Later he looked back with shame upon this violent revenge, and was sure to grant without the least difficulty whatsoever any Theban asked of him. He atoned in part by his leniency with Athens. He forgave her violation of the pledges made to him a year before, and did not press his demands for the surrender of Demosthenes and the other anti-Macedonian leaders. To the end of his life, he maintained an attitude of respect and affection for Athens. He dedicated on the Acropolis various spoils from his Asiatic victories, sent back to Athens the tyrannicide statues that Xerxes had taken away, and remarked, after an arduous campaign, O ye Athenians, will ye believe what dangers I incur to merit your praise? Now, are we to say that Alexander the Great was a prince or knight of wands, or was he a king or knight of wands? Having received again the allegiance of all the Greek states except Sparta, Alexander returned to Macedonia and prepared for the invasion of Asia. He found his state treasury almost empty with the deficit of 500 talents, 3 million as a legacy from Philip's reign. He borrowed 800 talents and set out to conquer not the world but his debts. He had hoped to fight Persia as the champion of all Hellas, but he knew that half of Greece was praying that he would soon be killed. It was reported that the Persians could muster 1,000,000 men. Alexander's expeditionary force did not exceed 30,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. Nevertheless, the new Achilles, leading 12,000 soldiers under Antipater, the guard of Macedonia, and watch Greece, set out in 334 BCE upon the most daring and romantic enterprise in the history of kings. He would live 11 years more, but would never see home or Europe again. While his army crossed the Hellespont from Sestos to Abydos, he himself chose the land at Cape Sigium and retrace what he believed to have been Agamemnon's path to Troy. At every step he quoted to his comrades passages from the Iliad, which he knew almost by heart. He anointed the reputed tomb of Achilles, crowned it with garlands, and run naked around it according to the custom of antiquity. People also did nude pilgrimages in Mecca until Muhammad gained control. Happy Achilles, he acclaimed to have had in life so faithful a friend, and after his death, so famous a poet to celebrate him. He vowed now to carry through to a successful end that long struggle between Europe and Asia, which had begun at Troy. It is not necessary to our purpose to tell again the story of his victories. He met the first Persian contingent at the river Granicus and overwhelmed it. Heraclitus saved his life by severing the arm of the Persian who was about to strike Alexander from behind. A whimsical student might build upon such events as an accidental interpretation of history. After giving his men the west, he marched down into Ionia, offering the Greek cities democratic self-government under his protectorate. Most of them opened their gates without resistance. At Issus, he met the main force of the Persians, 600,000 men under Darius III. Once more, he won by using his cavalry for attack, his infantry for defense. Darius fled, leaving his purse and his family behind him to be treated, the one with gratitude, the other one with chivalry. After peaceably taking Damascus and Sidon, Alexander laid siege to Pera, which was harboring a large Phoenician squadron in the pay of Persia. The ancient city resisted so long that when at last he captured it, Alexander lost his head and allowed his men to massacre 8,000 Carians and sell 30,000 as slaves. Jerusalem surrendered quietly and was well treated. Gaza fought till every man in the city was dead and every woman raped. And of course, Canaanite and Palestinian and Phoenician and such weren't really the national identity. They were just phrases used for those peoples. The triumphant march of the Macedonians was resumed through the Sinai Desert into Egypt. where he showed a tactful respect for the country's so-called gods. Alexander was welcomed as a divinely sent liberator from Persian rule. Knowing that religion is stronger than politics, he crossed another desert to the oasis of Siwa and paid his respects to Ammon, his very father, if Olympius could be believed. The pliant priest crowned him pharaoh with the ancient rites, and so eased the way for the Ptolemaic dynasty. The Ptolemaic dynasty? I didn't even remember how the Greek is, but Ptolemaic. Returning to Delta, Alexander conceived or approved an idea of building a new capital at one of the Nile's many mouths. Perhaps the Greek merchants at nearby Naucratis suggested it as providing a more convenient depot for the enlarged Greek trade that might now be expected between Egypt and Greece. He marked out the orbit of the walls of Alexandria, the outline of the principal streets, and the sites for temples to the Egyptian and Grecian entities regarded as gods. Perhaps it was just the garb of language and stuff. It was the same entities, maybe. Um, Further details he left to his architect, Neocrates. Neocrates had pleased Alexander by proposing to carve Mount Athos, 6,000 feet high, into a figure of Alexander standing waist deep in the sea, holding a city in one hand and a harbor in the other. The project was never carried out. Uh, who knows? Some of this stuff may have been carried out, just not um, survived. Right? Marching back into Asia, he met the vast polyglot army of Darius. Darius is how it says in that language. At Gaugamela, near Arbela, and was dismayed by their multitude, for he knew that one defeat would cancel all his victories. His soldiers comforted him. Be of good cheer, sire. Do not fear the great number of the enemy, for they will not be able to stand the very smell of the goat that clings to us. He spent the night in reconnoitering the ground on which he was to give battle, and in offering sacrifices to what was considered to be gods, his victory was decisive. The disorderly host of Darius could make no headway against the phalanxes, and knew not how to defend themselves against the swift and incalculable dashes of the Macedonian cavalry. They broke and fled, and Darius was not the last to go. While Darius's generals assassinated him as a coward, Alexander received the submission of Babylon, partook of its wealth, and distributed some of it to his soldiers, and charmed the city by making obeisance to what it considered to be its gods, and decreeing the restoration of its sacred shrines. By the end of the year 331 BCE, he had reached Susa, his population still remembering the ancient glory of Elam, welcomed him as a deliverer. He protected the city from pillage, comforted his troops by dividing among them some of the 50,000 talents, $300 million, 1938 U.S., that he found in Darius's vaults. To the people of Plata'a, he sent a substantial sum because they had so bravely resisted the Persians in 480, and to the Greek cities of Asia he appears to have remitted the donations that he had elicited from them at the outset of his campaign, and he announced proudly to the Greeks of the world that they were now completely free from Persian rule. Hardly stopping to rest at Susa, he marched over the mountains in the depth of winter to seize Persepolis, and so rapidly did he move that he was in Darius's palace before the Persians could conceal the royal treasury. Here again his good judgment left him, and he burned the magnificent city to the ground. His soldiers looted the houses, ravaged the women, and killed the men. Perhaps they had been infuriated by seeing, on their approach to the town, 800 Greeks who, for various reasons, had suffered mutilation at the hands of the Persians by the cutting off of legs, arms, or ears, or the gouging out of eyes. Alexander, moved to tears by the sight, gave them lands and assigned dependents to work for them. Still insatiate, he attempted now what Taras Turash, I think is how you pronounce his name, the Great had failed to accomplish: the subjugation of the tribes that hovered on the eastern borders of Persia. Perhaps in his simple geography he hoped to find, beyond that mystic east, the ocean that would serve as a natural frontier for his conquered realm. Entering Sogdiana, he came upon a village inhabited by the descendants of those Rankidah who in 480 had surrendered to Xerxes the treasures of their temple. Near Miletus, fevered with the thought that he was revenging the pillaged god, he ordered all the inhabitants slain, including the women and children, visiting the sins of fathers upon the fifth generation. His campaign in Sogdiana, Ariana, and Bactriana was bloody and bootless. He achieved some victories, found some gold, and left enemies everywhere behind him. Near Saqqara, his men captured Bessus, who had slain Darius. Alexander, suddenly making himself the avenger of the great king, had Bessus whipped almost to death, had his nose and ears cut off, and then sent him to Ecbatana, where he was executed by having his arms tied to one and his legs to the other, two trees that had been drawn together by ropes, so that when the ropes were cut, the trees pulled the body to pieces. Crucifixion of various forms goes back into prehistory. At every new remove from Greece, Alexander was becoming less and less a Greek, more and more a barbarian king. The year 327 BCE found him passing over the Himalayas into India. Vanity conspired with curiosity to lead him into such distant territory. His generals advised against it. His army obeyed him unwillingly. Crossing the Indus, he defeated King Porus and announced that he would continue to the Ganges. But his soldiers refused to go farther. He pled with them, and for 3 days, like a scion of Achilles, pouted in his tent, and they had enough. Suddenly he turned back, loath to face west again, and forced his way through hostile tribes with such personal bravery that his soldiers wept at their inability to realize all his dreams. He was the first to scale the walls of the Malians. After he and 2 others had leaped into the city, the ladders broke, and they found themselves alone amidst the enemy. Alexander fought till he sank exhausted by his wounds. Meanwhile, his troops had made their way into the town, and soldier after soldier sacrificed his life to protect the fallen king. When the battle was over, Alexander was carried to his tent, and his veterans kissed his garments as he passed. After 3 months of convalescence, he renewed his march along the Indus, and at last reached the Indian Ocean. There he sent on part of his forces by water under Nearchus, who skillfully accomplished the long voyage in unfamiliar seas. Alexander himself led the rest of his army northwest along the coast of India and through the desert of Eurasia, Baluchistan, where the sufferings of the men rivaled those of Napoleon's army on the return from Moscow. Heat killed thousands, thirst killed more. A little water was found and was brought to Alexander, but he deliberately poured it out upon the ground. When the remnants of his force reached Susa, some 10,000 had died, and Alexander was half insane. Now, remember that Napoleon won in Russia, but the winter was so bad that 90% of his men had died by the time, they were done retreating. And by a trick, really, he ended up surviving himself. So